in these novels in particular, there's, they inhabit worlds that are complex and entire in themselves, worlds that are often set in other places, other times, other milieus, other communities. So what I want to begin with is actually to ask each of them whether among all these othernesses, and there is never one generic otherness, you have to create each character as a being, one who inhabits, again, his or her universe. Is gender the greatest distance from yourself that you have to traverse while creating these worlds and these books? Could we start with Chandrahas?
Yes, I mean, I don't know to what extent my experience is representative, but I suppose it, in answer to your question, it would depend, the answer would be different depending on what kind of book you're writing. I'm sure you could have a different answer for this question at different stages of your life. I think, I remember, I think my education about gender actually came through novels. Way before I had the chance to, before girls would talk to me, I found that I could read books and think about somebody else's life through that. And I think when I came to writing Clouds, which came out last year, the storyline in that book is about someone who is in his 40s and who has been bypassed by the sexual revolution. He's recently divorced, and he finds that the language that he once knew to deal with women and to approach them no longer works in the world. It's not valid anymore. And he sort of has to update his records, and he's entering the 20th century a bit late, and he looks around him and he can't recognize the landscape, the romantic, emotional and sexual landscape of India. And so all the certainties fall away. And I found writing that quite interesting in trying to work out not only what he would think about the people he was trying to meet, but how he thought they were looking at him. And so there were all these scenes where these different modes of perception played out across each other. But actually, the hardest thing I found in that book was writing the part of the tribal boy from Orissa who lives amongst two Oriya Brahmins in a single-room apartment in Bombay, and trying to work out that part of the book is about a cloud religion that this boy belongs to. And I found writing that convincingly much more difficult than I did trying to write the parts of two urban women from different countries who meet Farad on the other side of clouds and with whom he has all these encounters. And so I think it really depends on what project you take on in a book. But actually, what you want to do as a writer is do the work that's difficult for you, not the work that's easy for you. And if in some cases that involves gender, then actually you want to set yourself that sort of target.
Mm-hmm. Mahesh, polite society in particular?
I'd have to say that for myself, gender is probably the least distance that I would find difficult in terms of traveling, because I think a lot of this is about not necessarily lived experience, but observed experience. And most of us have been around women. We've been around, mothers, grandmothers, sisters, friends. Whereas there may be lives that are very, very different from ours, which we absolutely have had no ability to look into. So for me, I honestly have never felt it to be a difficulty or a problem. And when I wrote my first book, which had 3 female protagonists, I was constantly surprised by the fact that the question that I was asked more than any other was about writing women from the point of view of a man, because it had never occurred to me that it was anything odd or anything that should not be done, or because at the end of the day, these are characters, and you observe them in all their complexity as individuals. And sure, if you're writing a type, then your stereotypes can sort of overshadow what you're doing. But I think when you inhabit a character in all its complexity, the gender, it doesn't fall away, but it becomes part of that complexity. It becomes part of who they are. And certainly with Polite Society, which is a reimagining of a Jane Austen novel, you take your cue from Austen, who writes incredibly complex and wonderful female characters, and particularly Emma, which is the book that I reimagined. I mean, Emma is, by her own description, the least likable character. So again, you take your cues from an author who had great insight into a woman's situation at that time, and wrote very, very sharply about money and marriage and how a woman made her way in those difficult circumstances.
Amitabha, all your novels, but since we're here with Half the Night Is Gone, for which you're shortlisted, congratulations.
Thank you. So, I would say that, I agree with Mahesh in the sense that the question of gender doesn't go away that easily. I mean, upper caste people have always found it very easy to ignore the lower castes and the tribals, as Chandrahas was mentioning. And when it comes to crossing boundaries of time and other kinds of subjectivities, if they're far enough away, we are able to ignore them. But gender is something that you cannot ignore. It's like in astronomy, you have those the twin star systems where they sort of go around each other. The male subjectivity is constituted by the female subjectivity. What that means is essentially that men become. I mean, what I feel is that men become men by answering certain questions raised by women, and they are forced to sort of difficult questions that they find difficult to answer. So for me, writing has always been a very gendered process. I focused on maleness as a gendered condition, as opposed to what I perceived when I started writing was that maleness is seen as equal to humanness, but so there's humanness equal to maleness, and there's femaleness. I found that proposition a little difficult to accept. So I would think of it as that, okay, humanness is equal to maleness plus femaleness, and within that we try to create characters. So the aspect of gender is very important, and in that sense it is the closest but also the most difficult, because of its closeness it's confounding. I mean, let's be clear, right? It's our neighbor who is our biggest enemy, right? Not the person who lives far away, right?
Deepak?
So this is an interesting question because for a long time I didn't think I could write. I don't think that has really changed. But I think about voice when I think of gender. What does gender sound like? And this is important to me simply because I grew up in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates. I went to a segregated school. I went to an Indian community school. And so I went to school in the afternoon. The girls went in the morning. And when they were leaving school, all of us would be standing by the gates, pretending that we weren't watching them, but trying to watch them from the corner of our eye. And we'd tell tales about them, but we didn't know them. We didn't know how to converse. I mean, just to walk up to someone and say, "What is your name?" wasn't acceptable. Instead, we had to walk around and act like a bloody flamingo and not do anything and walk away. And I say all this simply because I'll relate it to a story. I teach in Abu Dhabi. I teach for New York University, and I teach a class called The Outsider. And there's one particular piece I teach. It's called Trailhead. It's written by the writer E.O. Wilson, and it's a story about ants, insects. And it's a story about a colony called the Trailhead Colony, and it's about the queen ant who is dying. And there are lines in there, one in particular about the male ant basically being a guided missile loaded with sperm. Because the male ant has no other function. It, does what it needs to do, and then it dies, a horrible death, dehydration or whatever. It can't fend for itself. And then I ask my students, what do you think of this? And they say, she has it spot on. This is the problem with the world, and only a woman could write this. And they go on for around 25 minutes. And then I tell them, E.O. Wilson is a man. And, they go, what? I said, E.O. Wilson is a man. and E. Wilson, is an expert in ants, a biologist. But how they perceive women to write fascinates me. Because it's as though a woman can't write a certain way or a man can't write a certain way. And that's something that I grapple with constantly. Simply because, I create things, but I'm so unsure of the creation itself that I want to be sure that when I deploy this individual or thing that I've created into the world on the page, they have something to do that's relevant. I don't know if I do it well, but for me, that's the fundamental question. What does gender sound like? Forget a man or a woman or a monster. What does gender sound like? I don't have a proper response. So that's why I'm rambling, which is why I'm going to stop.
To intersperse that with my own experience as a reader primarily, and also when invited to moderate, my initial reaction was one of befuddlement, because I thought, but why are we talking about this initial? I don't get either brickbats or bouquets for writing in the voice of a dog or a demon tiger. And then I remembered my own childhood and years of actually having prescribed texts by H. Rider Haggard and Dickens, and being extremely frustrated with the kind of women, not always Dickens at least, but Wilkie Collins, being really frustrated by the kind of women who were being portrayed, whether it was Aisha in She, who's kind of unforgettable, and then also remembering just how reaffirming it was, reassuring, but also challenging to read Ovid, who 2,000 years ago wrote the Heroines. It's a book of epistolary verse where he imagines the Greek and Roman heroines, female characters, as writing letters to the men in their lives. And it was one of the most exhilarating reads I'd ever had, of closer home, growing up with Bashir, who had these amazing portrayals, or later still Kolatkar, who in Sarpasatra writes from the perspective of Jarat Guru, who is not just a woman but a snake woman. And something that I noticed in all four of your books, plural and singular, is they were complex, plausible, intriguing women, never stereotypes, or when they were stereotypes, it was very clear that it was the gaze of another protagonist and not the authorial voice, and that's, again, an important distinction. And you spoke about sound, Deepak, so I'd like to start my next series of questions with a little, very short quotation from Deepak's book, Temporary People, and chapter 2, Birds. Anna Varghese worked in Abu Dhabi. She taped people. Specifically, she taped construction workers who fell from incomplete buildings. And this is a chapter which looks at a few days in the life of Anna Varghese. And you have, these women who kind of interleave a largely male-occupied world, but women who are full of quiddity, who are themselves. Nalinakshi, who in one short page is just so authoritative. So this is what's supposed to be a taped interview. And you can hear her impatience with the reporter who's asking her what it is like to be a matriarch. Parvadiyamma, the Muttashi, who is an almost mythical figure, but instantly recognizable because in some ways she's everybody's great-grandmother, the person you thought was magical and just entirely unpredictable. But the one who struck me the most was Mukundan's wife in chapter 6, the nameless wife. I'd like you to tell us a little more about which for you was maybe the most challenging, and the orality of it, because a lot of it is the cadences, the rhythms that make up a person or that make up his or her world.
I mean, do you ever ask an easy question? So here's the thing. English is the only language I read, write, and speak in. I have Malayalam, which I speak, but I can't read it. In a state where everyone celebrates that everyone's literate, when I walk in and everything's fucked up. And the reason I say that is because when I think of Malayalam, I think of the cadences and the musicality of it. So when I was writing these women, now in the Gulf, when you read stories about people in the Gulf, especially if you follow the press, it's almost always about the men. And I'm not saying the men shouldn't be talked about or spoken about. They're relevant, they matter. But you also have children and women and people who identify as something in between. And my mother is a housewife, if I have to define her. But she's more than that. But my mother is also ordinary. You're not going to read about her in textbooks. She's not going to be celebrated at events. But I don't give a damn. But when I recall a person like my mother, what do I do with that? How do I recall her period? So I use language. So you mentioned Nalinakshi. My grandmother's name was Nalini. She died in 97. And I started forgetting her voice. So I figured, all right, if someone is recording her, what would she sound like? She's authoritative because I was a child whenever I interacted with her. That's why she sounds like what she sounds like. So when she says pravasi, which means anything you want it to be, means foreigner, worker, outsider. That's grandma. When Muttashi, in the chapter that you stated, starts speaking, that's my great-grandmother. So I learned the Ramayana from her orally, and I can still hear her voice. And she was a grand woman. She would be on the bed and and she'd say, "Idikke, sit." And I'd sit and I'd listen. So I wanted to sort of duplicate that. The problem is, when you write about these people, there's something that I struggle with, and I'll end with this. It's writing about sex. Because that's the elephant in the room, when you think about gender. Because sex is not just, children, please close your ears, it's not just about fucking. It's about a bunch of other things as well. But how do you write it in a way that makes people pay attention? So there was this woman, and I just discovered her recently. Unfortunately, she passed. Her name is Candy Royale. She's a spoken word artist, and she writes about making love and fucking and the violence and the tenderness and the vulnerability in a way that I want to do that, but I don't know how to do that. So basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to do the best that I can with the limited knowledge that I possess, and that knowledge is memory. Embedded in the languages I have, Malayalam, Arabic, which I do not speak, but I can read it and not understand a bloody thing. And then Urdu and Hindi, which I understand. But I have to wait for my brain to translate from English to Malayalam to Hindi or to Urdu, which takes a bloody long time. So I can rarely have a conversation in those languages. But I need them. So the struggle comes in trying to articulate what you're trying to do. And you hope that when someone reads it and responds to it the way you do, then you're like, thank you. So yeah.
The body is actually a great place to segue to Chandrahas, because in Clouds, the gazes of the various protagonists are very corporeal. They're almost anatomical. Whether it's Dr. Billy Moria's gaze on himself or on the women around him, or whether it's, like you said, the Cloud community and that entire conversation around Ija and Oi, which Rabi is having. It's very physical. And the thing it reminded me of was something I read very recently, which is, it's a really interesting article, and I recommend it. It's in, I think it's in Walsha, about what it is, who can talk about whom. So it's fiction, and it's about appropriation, etc. And one of the people, Victor Laval, who wrote a novel called The Changeling, said, I start by imagining a different body. And Chandrahas, I wanted to know if you could identify with that, because there's so much physicality in all these beings.
It's strange when you think about one's own romantic and sexual experience. One becomes, sometimes in life, one only becomes aware of one's own body through somebody else's gaze at it. It's you think that you know yourself better than anyone else, but it's and that I think it's the same spirit that works in fiction, which is that somebody else's gaze often tells you something very truthful about yourself, and we don't just see other people in life. We have a need to be seen by them and to know what they think, and we are always trying to work out what they're trying to think. And I sort of found this, and I like writing about love and relationships for precisely this reason, in that I don't think when you're in a relationship with somebody, there's only two people involved. There's usually four. It's not just you and the other person, it's also who you think the other person is and who the other person thinks you are. And these kinds are this is a game of substances and shadows that is kind of has in a dialogue with each other. And what you want to do as a fiction writer is not necessarily explain it the same way that I'm trying to do to you right now, because we are talking at a more theoretical level about how we construct texts and how we write about experience. But you want to find moments in human encounters by which readers will work that out for themselves. That's what a novel does. It compresses meaning, and then hopefully you want the reader to unpack it because you've given them some cues. And it could be that they also misread what you say and they take it off in another direction, and you have to be comfortable with that. But in Clouds, I think the scene I enjoyed writing the most, or the moment in Farad's experiments with his own body and those of others, was it's when he finds himself making love to Zara for the first time. And he's been celibate for very long, and he's forgotten what it's like to be embraced by another human being. And it's dark, and his hand appears in the darkness and caresses his cheek, which he likes very much. And then he suddenly realizes it's actually his own hand twisted around his lover's neck, and it's come around the other side. And you never know where all your body parts go in some situations. And that's when he works out that, but it is as if when somebody else is in that embrace with you, your own sense of yourself is changed, and you can, the same fingers that you have with you all the time, when they come around somebody else's head, perhaps they have a different meaning. And in this way, I think, it's wonderful to be a writer, because you have the license to ask all sorts of questions to people. And I think because of the way, especially the generation which we grew up, somewhat half between the old India where you never talked about these things and the new one where you don't talk about anything else than these things. To be stuck between these two positions, sometimes, I often talk about writing at universities, and you speak with young people, and it's amazing to see how frank some of this stuff is, which I sort of, for me, this is a learned way of thinking. It was not something that came naturally to me. And what you want to do then is actually, writing is a way of expanding, going outside of your own experience into that of your society and your generation. And what you want to do as a writer is put together different stories, which then readers work out through the contrast between them, how time passes and how the world changes. And a part of that, of course, is what we have and what we hate to lose and what degrades and ages. And when it says goodbye to the world, so do our souls, which is the body.
Amitabha, moving to you. So Half the Night Is Gone is located about a century and a bit ago, about a century ago. Yes, it begins in pre-independence India. And it is set in a zamindari family, but it revolves around the satellites that make that family, that allow that family their existence. It is a very male-dominated world in as much as the decision makers are men. The women, and what's interesting is what the women do actually, and the roles they play as catalysts while seemingly being very quiescent. What I found again memorable was just how their inner lives, their desires, find very precise delineation. And there are several characters. We were talking a little while ago about the beginning of the book, and Radharani and Ombati, the wrestler Mangeram's daughters-in-law, who in various ways kind of, shall we say, orientate his later life. Sadei, who defines his earlier life. Right. But the person who, like I told you a little while ago, stayed with me, was most memorable, is someone who's not at all central to any of this, any of the events in themselves. It's Kamla, who is Lalaji's elder daughter-in-law, Suvarnalata's cousin, and the widow who lives in an ashram that the Lalaji has built. Right. It's a tale of unrequited devotion, not love. Right. But what I found is it's counterintuitive, and yet it sort of represents a very beautiful tradition that we're all familiar with, which is of bhakti. Yeah, right. Could you tell us about about imagining her also, because she comes out with dignity, and you have imbued it with so much compassion, without it necessarily having what would, ostensibly be a narrative function. She could not be there and the story would just continue in a sense.
Right.
But she gives it so much depth.
Right.
What and why and how. And Kamala.
Okay, so I have to apologize to Chandrahas because my mind was wandering while he was speaking. It's not your fault, by the way. And because I just realized, based on our conversation earlier, that the role of bhakti in this book is central. And I just realized that it comes together with. Okay, let me put it this way: that what is subjectivity is what? Subjectivity is an emotional texture, right? How do I convey a character? How do I define a character? I define a character by a sequence of emotional textures that that character generates in the reader and in myself. First myself, and then hopefully through myself in a reader. Now the thing is that in the bhakti tradition, from Geet Govind onwards, right? Geet Govind, which is one of the finest literary works out of Odisha since Clouds, right, Chandras? So from the Geet Govind onwards, there is a detailed description of the Nayika's states of mind. How does Radha feel? Khandit Nayika, the notion of Prem Vaichitya, where you feel the loss of the lover when in the embrace, how you anticipate, how your the physical sensations you, the gopi, you, Radha, feel as you go through the different kinds of emotional states that you feel when the lover is not with you, or when the lover is approaching, or when the lover is with you, and so on and so forth. So these people had completely mapped it out in some sense. And I took their lead, Surdas and what's his name, Jaidev. Jaidev particularly, he's very good at it because Jaidev is extremely lyrical. He's extremely lyrical. So what he does is he puts that emotional texture into what Dinesh was talking about, into sound. He puts it into sound. And you hear it, Dheer Samire, Yamuna Tire, Vasati Vane Vanmali. Right? You can smell the champa flowers in Jaidev. It's like that. And specifically about Kamala, the character of Kamala, I basically owe to that and to a Baul song, Poro Jonome. Say, Poro Jonome Hoyo Radha, where which sung by Pavan Das Baul, great rendition. Other people have also sung it. So Radha is saying that you Krishna, you don't understand what we women go through. So what you should do is, in your next birth, you should be born as Radha, so that you know. And you can see how that the genders revolve around another, because it's a woman's voice, but by a Baul poet who's male, sung by another male, and imbibed by another male, goes to a female character, and it helps create that texture. So Kamala is a woman who loves, right, and she's in love with this guy who basically has no clue. And not only are her sensations, but the way she sees him, the way she views him, we will find out, and we've already found out, that he is quite callow actually. He's not all that, and to some extent she knows that, but she's still in love, right? She's still in love. The bhakti poets, they're very careful in not telling you what Krishna thinks. They always sort of manage to find their way around that. So I mean, to cut it short, essentially I feel subjectivity is a texture. Music and poetry work at the level of texture. So I try to some extent to just basically steal their stuff and bring it into my thing, so that I could create the texture of a female subjectivity, because I felt I didn't have any other way of doing it.
Right. Well, Mahesh, hi, finally you're back. So, polite society, you are picking on the template of Emma, Jane Austen's Emma, with a famously unlikable heroine, And you do something really interesting, which I almost found an inversion, which is that Anya, so your Emma equivalent, is sometimes almost a MacGuffin to the peripheral women characters, notably Dimple, so who's Harriet Smith, more or less, and Renu Khurana, who is an aunt in your book and who is Emma's governess in the original, who becomes Mrs. Weston. Can you tell us a little more about that? And also the fact that perhaps, if it's possible, you're even more dismissive of the men than Jane Austen herself is.
Yeah, I think the first thing about Emma was there is no point trying to slavishly imitate a much-loved classic. If you're going to bother to reimagine something, you have to find the gaps in the original in which you can insert yourself and your work. And so this was always my starting point. And the thing with Emma is she is unlikable and difficult, but we make a lot of allowances for her because of the time in which that novel was set. And we also forget how young Emma in the novel is. She's only 19. So, Emma is someone who probably had the best kind of education that a woman would have had at that time, a woman of her class. But it's still a very circumscribed education. She would have learnt the things that it was thought befitting for women, and she would not have learnt other things that men of her class would have learnt. And so we make allowances that even though she is this meddling, interfering creature, she is a person of her times. And we would remember that people at that time would have very little interaction with classes other than their own. So even though she may have done a little bit of charity work in the parish, she wouldn't really have known very much about the lived experience of a working class person. Now, if you're going to reimagine this in the 21st century, someone like Anya, an incredibly privileged South Delhi, a young woman of 26, there are very few excuses for the kind of bad behavior that a meddling, interfering person might indulge in. She would have had the best education money can buy. There is absolutely no reason why she should not have read or discovered about the inner lives of people who are very different to her own. So it's this intersection of gender and class that I was quite interested in. And with all of the women, I mean, I think you have to... I was trying quite hard to place them in that prism. So, for example, even though Anya believes she's this gilded creature who wanders around in a fated way, when she moves to her literary residency, and she discovers that she's become the target of a very predatory man who inveighs himself into her confidences and fundamentally and quite brutally lets her down. Sometimes even your class is not a protection against things that the world can throw at you. And likewise, with a character you mentioned, Nina, who's not in the original, but again, an older woman, very much of her class, extremely privileged, but now finding that she's got very few resources to fall back on. Now that her beauty is gone, her beauty is faded, her interest to men has gone, her ability to manipulate and to seduce and to make her way in that world is very, very much reduced. So again, these are ways of departing from the original novel so that you're not writing a pastiche of any kind, but at the same time trying to instill complexity in these characters and to make them relevant and modern for our time.
Thank you. We've got 8 minutes left, so I think we open, or a little more than 8. Okay. There's one question which I think a lot of people were interested in, which is whether it's open to all of you, which is whether the current environment that we're in, with so much awareness, with both Time Out and Me Too being such, predominant forces for the good, does that weigh in consciously or unconsciously on the process of writing or of imagining or at any stage in the pre conceptualizing phase.
Okay. No, I was wondering if you're going to BIC, it's still a long way.
I think
But
if I can,
because it's
for
in the
myself,
same-
I can say that it does and it should. We don't have to agree with everything on every side, but we have to accept the challenge and the questions that are being raised, that a power structure is being attacked, undermined, and possibly changed, maybe not to the extent that one thinks it is. And as writers, if we don't respond to that, then then we're not responding to one of the most important things happening in our times.
Mahesh?
Yeah, I mean, I hope we should have been interrogating these things even before the last couple of years when this all exploded. We should have been focusing, and I hope we have been. But I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you talked about Dickens, for example, and many other wildly fated authors who have written poor female characters. And I think that's why we end up having these discussions. Why are these men so lauded, so fated when they write ciphers when it comes to women? And we've all read these novels, or at least I hope some of you haven't read them. But these sort of middle-aged college professors who are find themselves to be sort of inordinately attractive to breathless young students who are all, ciphers, who are all there to look pretty in sweaters under the maple trees. So, I mean, we've read these books and we've tried to steer ourselves away from these books. And I think with these other conversations that are happening, these are constant reminders that, and also like Amitabha said, that this is a very broad umbrella. There are all kinds of behaviors and power dealings that are subsumed under this, and we have to look at them very carefully and identify their components, because there is a lot of complexity in this as well.
Chandrahas?
Well, I don't have much to say, but I always think at discussions like this, sometimes it's nice to think about what other people have done in their novels. And while you're talking, I suddenly remembered earlier this year I read something very interesting that you could say is about a group of men and women working together to work out what is the nature of power in our society and how does that operate in ways that end up with women feeling subjugated and their voices not being heard. And it's an experiment in Indian novel in the 1920s where a group of young writers in Orissa got together, 5 men and 4 women, and they co-wrote a book with the woman as the main character, Basanti. It was just published in English, translated this year, although it's been out in Oriya for 100 years or so. And I found it enormously fascinating to think about how a group of idealistic young people think there's something wrong with our world. And what we do is, instead of writing things about it ourselves, which readers will then pick apart and say, well, this is a man's view of women and that's a woman's view of women. Why don't we do something together? And when you read the book, sometimes you have to look down at the footnote on the first page of any chapter to see, did it change hands or not? Did one of the men give way to one of the women writers or not? And sometimes you're surprised, you can't tell, as Deepak was saying sometimes, what has gone on. And I found this a remarkable experiment. Sometimes when you look at an unpleasant situation today and you think there's something clearly wrong with this world and some things have come out, you think, what are the past, can we go back into the past in thinking about writing novels? Can we go back into the past of the novel itself to see what did people of another time think about a world like that? And in this way, I find the world of the larger world of the Indian novel very consoling, because all the things that sometimes we think of as new have, literature tells us, been there before, have happened before. And in a way, sometimes these moments are stimuli for us to try and work out the connections so that you can proceed forward in a more integrated way.
Deepak?
I think the response needs time, days, years, really. I mean, I write to negotiate and navigate my world. This is extremely uncomfortable. With the spotlights, it feels like I'm being interrogated. But writing's all I've got. Because writing's all I've got, I need to make mistakes. I should be allowed to make mistakes and then be called on it when the mistakes are made so that we could have potential conversations. I say this simply because I was terribly ignorant when I was younger, not that I'm better now, but then I started reading and watching things. I'll give you an example. So I use pop culture in my classes a lot. And there's Christine and the Queens, which is a band that I adore. And then when she came out with the video Tilted, and there were others, she sort of forced me to rethink what a woman or a man is supposed to look like and how they're supposed to move. And I go, thank you for that. I teach Eula Biss, who wrote a wonderful book called Notes from No Man's Land. She's on the surface a white woman, but she's writing about race in Chicago. And she does it with such tenderness and vulnerability that you go, bravo. But then I have students who take, issue with that because she's white. How could you? How can you? What about your privilege? Which she writes about. And, and I come from a city where you're scrutinized for what you look like. You have no choice in the matter. I'm a brown boy. I'm a brown man. I'll always be Indian-ish. I can't be anything else. So when you write about that particular city, people are curious about how you're writing about that city, whether you're telling the truth. And for me, at the end of it, and forgive me, I say, fuck it. Because I don't know what the truth is, but I want to get as close to it as possible, which is why I write. Because I want to get as close to it as possible so that when a reader reads me and they respond to me, they go, here's something you should do. Here's what you should read. Here's what you should watch. Here's what you should listen. But, a short answer to the question, do I think about this? You bet. It's probably why I write so fucking slow. Like, I take my time because I'm afraid. But I write because I'm afraid. And I live because I'm afraid. But it's the only way. And, if you want to pelt me afterwards, okay. But if you want to have a discussion where you go, I'm going to buy you dinner, and I'm going to swear at you, but I'm going to buy you dinner, and we'll talk about your work. And I'll go, I'm down with that. That I can live with. And that's the hope. That's why I make work. I say make work like I have 5 books. I have 1 book. That's why I do what I do.